People like you, unemployed and with little education, are not welcome in this house. Those were the cruel words my mother-in-law said to me, right before she splashed hot water on me and I screamed in pain. It's hot. Please stop. I couldn't believe what was happening. Her behavior left me in shock. Throwing boiling water on someone is a terrible thing, no matter the reason. Fortunately, I wasn't burned, but it could have been much worse. I couldn't believe it. How could my mother-in-law treat me like this? What made it even harder to accept was that her words weren't even true. It wasn't me who was unemployed, it was my husband, Jack. He had lost his job, but I had been working hard to support the family. And yet here I was being blamed and insulted. My anger began to grow. I felt like I had reached my limit. I couldn't tolerate her behavior anymore. I decided to stand up for myself. I told her, "If that's how you feel about me, then I'm leaving. You win." My mother-in-law didn't seem bothered at all. In fact, she seemed happy and told me, "Finally, you're leaving. That makes things easier for me." Her cold reaction made it clear she didn't regret what she had done. I realized I no longer wanted to stay in such a toxic place. Without wasting any time, I packed my bags and left. I returned to my parents' house where I knew I would be treated with kindness. What my mother-in-law didn't know was that I wasn't helpless. In fact, I was the one keeping her household afloat financially. Since my husband had lost his job, I had started investing in stocks and was earning around 50,000 pesos a month. I didn't need to depend on her or anyone else to survive. Even if at some point she came to ask me for help with money, I had already decided I wouldn't help her. She had treated me so badly that I didn't think she deserved my kindness. She would have to live with the consequences of her actions. I was married to Jack for approximately 3 years. We met in college where we both studied economics. After graduating, we got jobs in different financial companies. Despite our busy schedules, we kept our relationship strong for years. When Jack proposed to me, he said, "Angela, I will make you happy. Please marry me." I believed him. I thought I would have a happy life with him, but things didn't turn out as I had imagined. Now looking back, I'm glad I had the strength to leave. Sometimes walking away from a bad situation is the best thing you can do for yourself. When Jack proposed, I happily said yes. I looked forward to that future. I told him we had decided to get married and that we thought we could build a happy life together. I was excited to start our own family and live as a married couple. However, not long after, Jack told me something I didn't expect. "Hey, Angela," he began. "Would you quit your job and move in with my mom?" I was surprised. "I don't mind quitting my job," I replied. "But we're newlyweds. I'd like us to live just the two of us." He seemed to understand what I said but added, "I'm worried about leaving my mom alone." "Don't worry, I'll make sure it's not difficult for you," he reassured me. Jack's father had passed away when he was in high school. Since then, he had lived with his mother. Being an only child, he felt responsible for taking care of her. Understanding his feelings, I agreed. "Okay, I'll live with you and your mom," I said. 3 weeks later, we moved into Jack's family home. At first, my mother-in-law seemed happy to have Jack back. She greeted us with a smile. But as soon as she looked at me, her expression changed. Her smile disappeared, and she gave me a cold, hard stare. It was clear she wasn't happy that I was there. She mumbled something under her breath, but I couldn't hear clearly. It sounded like, "It wasn't necessary for you to come." I tried to ignore it and smiled, but deep down I started to worry about living with her. Despite that, the first day passed without any major problems. The next morning, I was awakened by my mother-in-law yelling at me. "Are you still sleeping? Hurry up." I quickly got up and prepared breakfast. I looked at the clock. It was only 5 a.m. It was still dark outside. I couldn't believe she wanted breakfast so early. I sat down confused and asked her, "Why so early? Don't just lie around because you're not working." She scolded me. I was still half asleep, but I didn't want to argue with her. So I got up and started preparing breakfast. While I was cooking, she kept criticizing me. "Hurry up. Why are you so slow?" she said abruptly. I felt stressed and rushed, but I kept going. Finally, after 20 minutes, breakfast was ready. "I'm sorry to make you wait," I said politely. "Finally, you're done. Can't you do it faster?" she complained once more. Her harsh words hurt me, but I didn't say anything in response. I realized this was only the beginning of what life with her could be. When I sat down to eat breakfast, I couldn't help but feel uncomfortable living with my mother-in-law. It was already proving to be much harder than I expected. I wanted to tell her that it was impossible to cook any faster, but instead, I just smiled and tried to let it go. However, she wasn't done with her complaints. "This soup is too salty," she said, staring at me. "I don't think it's that salty," I replied cautiously. "What are you saying? Are you implying something's wrong with my taste? Are you trying to kill me by giving me such salty food?" She snapped. Her words left me stunned. I never had that intention. I hadn't even thought about it. Why was she accusing me like this? Why was she so harsh with me? Her behavior was confusing and hurtful. Trying to understand, I mustered the courage to ask her, "Mother-in-law, why are you so harsh with me? What are you talking about?" "I'm not being harsh," she said, acting as if she didn't know what I was referring to. "Or are you trying to make me look like the bad person here?" "No, that's not what I mean," I stammered, feeling overwhelmed by her attitude. Her pressure was making it difficult to continue the conversation. "Finish eating. Then clean the dishes. After that, there's laundry to do," she ordered. "There's no time to rest." From that day on, my mother-in-law continued to treat me harshly every day. She criticized me for everything. It was exhausting both mentally and physically. When I cleaned the house, she would say, "You missed the dust in the corners." When I washed the clothes, she would point out, "There's still a stain here. Are you even doing this right?" After a month of living like this, I felt like I couldn't take it anymore. One night, reaching my limit, I decided to talk to Jack. "Jack, I need to talk to you," I began. "Your mother says mean things to me every day, and it's very difficult for me. Could you ask her not to talk to me that way?" I was hoping Jack would comfort me or at least respond, but he didn't say anything. His silence bothered me even more. "Jack, are you listening?" I asked, frustrated. Then I noticed something strange. He looked pale, like he wanted to say something but didn't know how. "What's wrong? Everything okay?" I asked, worried. Jack hesitated before speaking. "Actually, I got fired from my job." I was shocked. "Is this a joke?" I asked incredulously. "No," he said quietly. "The company had to lay off many employees because profits went down. They decided to downsize and I lost my job." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "So you're unemployed now?" I asked, struggling to process the news. "Yes," he replied. "Starting tomorrow, I won't have a job anymore." I remained silent, unable to find the words to respond. Suddenly, my world felt even heavier. After receiving the notice that I would lose my job in a month, I realized I had little time left to find a solution. Fortunately, I had been using what I learned at the brokerage firm to trade stocks. At first it was difficult and I made some mistakes, but over time I improved and finally I started earning around 50,000 pesos a month. Thanks to this, we weren't struggling financially. I focused on supporting Jack and tried to ignore my mother-in-law's daily harassment. The next day, I decided to stay strong for Jack. He had just lost his job, and I felt it was my duty to support him. My mother-in-law's harsh treatment continued, but I endured it for Jack. A month passed, and Jack officially became unemployed. At first, he made an effort to look for a new job, but over time he started staying home more often and making excuses about why he wasn't applying anywhere. "Shouldn't you be taking your job search more seriously?" I suggested to him one day gently. "But it's hard to find a company that suits me," he replied. He didn't seem genuinely interested in finding work. I felt frustrated but kept quiet and continued to financially support our household. Meanwhile, my mother-in-law's treatment towards me worsened. She criticized me constantly, and I began to feel increasingly exhausted. At first, I thought I had to endure her behavior because he was unemployed, but eventually I stopped thinking that way. I began to feel drained and unhappy every day. One morning, Jack left the house earlier than usual. It was rare for him to leave so early, and I thought that maybe he was finally taking his job search seriously. After he left, I started with my usual chores. While I was cleaning, my mother-in-law was sitting on the living room sofa, drinking her coffee. "Make sure you clean properly," she said abruptly. "Don't miss any spots." I ignored her comments and continued with my work. As I was cleaning, she suddenly threw a tantrum and started yelling at me. How dare you ignore me? You're just a mere daughter-in-law. You don't even have a real job," she shouted. I tried to stay calm and continued cleaning, but her anger only grew. She approached me furiously and yelled even louder. "Unemployed, useless people like you have no place in this house. You should leave." Before I could respond, she grabbed the pot of hot water I had prepared for her coffee and poured it on me. The water splashed my skin. "It's hot. Please stop." I screamed in shock and pain. That was my breaking point. I realized I could no longer live in such a toxic environment. Her behavior was cruel and unacceptable, and I knew something had to change. I cried out without thinking when my mother-in-law threw the hot water on me. Luckily it wasn't boiling, so I wasn't seriously burned, but it could have been a terrible accident. Still, I was shocked and trembling from her actions. Caroline, my mother-in-law, didn't seem concerned. Instead, she smirked and said, "This is what I've been saying all along. If you're not working, you should leave this house." Her words hit me hard, but I was so tired of her behavior that I decided not to argue anymore. I took a deep breath and said, "Okay, I'll leave." "Good," she replied, sounding almost pleased. "Get out of here quickly. It makes things easier for me." I didn't want to spend another second in that toxic house. I packed my things and left that same day. I headed straight to my parents' house. When I arrived, they were surprised to see me since they weren't expecting me. But they welcomed me warmly and made me feel at home. I waited thinking that Jack would call or text to see how I was, but he didn't. Days turned into weeks, and there was still no news from him. I felt a little lonely but decided not to look for him. I thought, if he cares, he'll contact me first. A month passed and I still hadn't heard from Jack. During that time, my feelings for him began to fade. I started to consider the possibility of divorce. It seemed like he didn't care about me anymore. "Forgive me if I haven't done anything wrong." His words didn't make any sense. I replied calmly but firmly, "Thanks for saying that, but I don't think I've done anything I need to be forgiven for." Then I ended the intercom call. However, they didn't leave. Instead, my mother-in-law began banging on the door and shouting, "Don't hang up. Let us in and come back with us." Worried that their shouts and noises would disturb the neighbors, I was left wondering what to do. Reluctantly, I opened the door and let them in. I led them to the living room and invited them to sit down. Once they were seated, I asked them why they were here. What's going on? I didn't understand why they were there. My mother-in-law had been the one who insisted I leave, and now she was telling me to come back. Her behavior didn't make any sense. "You told me to leave. There's no way I can go back now," I said firmly, still confused and frustrated by the situation. I stood my ground and told my mother-in-law exactly how I felt. She became frustrated and accused me of being childish. She said she had forgiven me and that I should come back to live in her house. She even went so far as to say she was willing to let someone like me, who was unemployed and uneducated, stay there. I couldn't hold back any longer. "I'm not the one who's unemployed. Your son Jack is. And if I go back, he'll just treat me badly every day," I retorted. Jack looked at me, surprised when I said this, and my mother-in-law seemed confused. It was clear that Jack hadn't told her he had lost his job. I felt vindicated. Finally, Jack admitted the truth. He had been fired from his company. This prompted an onslaught of apologies and excuses from Jack. He tried to explain that he had been relying on my income to keep us financially stable. However, my mother-in-law was furious. She knew about Jack's unemployment and now openly scolded him. "Why didn't you tell me about this? What are we supposed to do now?" she shouted. Jack tried to calm her down by saying that for now, Angela's income was enough, but his response only made things worse. My mother-in-law called him useless for not looking for a new job. I scolded them even more. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I had been supporting both of them all this time, and Jack had just been sitting around. I began to wonder why I ever thought it was a good idea to support him in the first place. When my mother-in-law suggested again that I come back to live with them, I refused outright. "I'm not going back," I said. I couldn't imagine myself returning to that house after everything they had put me through. Then the situation escalated. I mentioned how my mother-in-law had thrown boiling water on me, and Jack's face turned pale. "She did that to you?" he asked, horrified. "Yes," I replied. Ask her yourself. Jack confronted his mother. Why would you do that? He demanded. She admitted it and said, because she ignored me. That's why I did it. Her excuse made me even angrier, and that led to a heated argument between Jack and his mother. Their shouting became too loud, so I intervened. Take this argument back to your own house. You're in someone else's home, and you're being too loud. Upon hearing my words, they calmed down slightly. Their bold and assertive attitude softened, and they began to plead with me to return. They promised not to treat me badly again. Jack said he would find a job, and my mother-in-law assured me she wouldn't cause any more trouble. But I didn't buy it. I didn't believe their promises. They felt empty. I knew I shouldn't trust them after everything that had happened. I told them honestly that their words didn't make sense to me. I knew they would only take advantage of me again if I went back. Their silence confirmed my doubts. Without saying anything more, I left the living room and went to my room, leaving them to think about their actions. After about 6 minutes, I returned to the living room. They were still sitting in the same place with their heads down without saying a word. Frustrated by the silence, I asked, "How long do you plan to sit here without saying anything? I don't care anymore." Instead of answering, Jack sighed deeply. He seemed surprised when I handed him a piece of paper. It was a divorce form with my name already signed on it. His face showed confusion as he looked at the document. "It's a divorce form," I said bluntly. "That's enough. I can't stay married to someone who can't find a job and didn't even bother to contact me after I left." Jack seemed taken aback. "Wait, please. This is too sudden," he said, clearly upset. His reaction irritated me. He didn't seem to understand that his actions or lack thereof were the reason things had come to this. He had ignored me when I needed support and had left me to deal with everything alone. "I've already made up my mind," I said firmly. "It doesn't matter what you say. I'm divorcing you." Jack still couldn't believe it. "Isn't divorce too drastic?" he asked. "No, it isn't," I replied coldly. "This is your fault." He turned to his mother, giving her the same cold tone. She was also to blame for how badly they had treated me. She didn't say anything, but her face showed resignation. In the end, Jack signed the divorce form, though he warned me not to do it. "I'm sorry, but I feel relieved. The one who might regret this is you," I told him confidently. "I'll file the divorce myself. I don't need any compensation. Just leave me alone and go home." With that, our marriage officially came to an end. It may have seemed harsh, but it was necessary to escape my mother-in-law's harassment and Jack's lack of responsibility. 3 weeks later, as I was relaxing at my parents' house, I received a phone call from my ex-mother-in-law. She sounded distraught. "You did something. Our electricity and gas have been cut off," she told me. I calmly explained that I had stopped paying for their upkeep, hers and Jack's. Her tone changed and she tried to ask for my help. It was clear she expected me to intervene and fix things for them as I used to. "I can only help for 2 months, but even that seems too much." Her request seemed unreasonable to me, especially since we were no longer together as a couple and didn't live in the same house. I told her no and suggested she ask Jack for help. After all, he had promised to get a job and support her. She didn't understand why I refused. She started begging me to help her, trying to make me feel guilty, saying that I was still her ex-daughter-in-law. Even so, I stood firm in my decision. I ended the call and blocked her number. After that, I decided to cut ties completely with my ex-mother-in-law, my brother-in-law, who had always bothered me, and Jack, who had always been unreliable. Once I made these changes, life at my parents' house became much more peaceful. I began to focus on myself and rebuild my life. A few months later, while I was on vacation and checking stock charts, I received a message from Jack. He apologized for everything and admitted that he had relied on me too much in the past. He also told me that he had recently found a job at a factory. Although he apologized, I had no interest in reconnecting with him or anyone from that part of my life. He also mentioned that his mother still treated him badly and asked if he could come back. After reading his message, I realized that there was no chance of us reconciling. 5 months after my divorce, a friend introduced me to a new man. He was reliable, kind, and treated me well. Although he was older than me, we got along very well. We weren't thinking about marriage right away, but we were enjoying the happy moments we spent together. I decided to focus on the present and let go of the painful memories of my past.